Hi, I'm Lillian. Welcome back to my channel Ink and Pages. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in winter, starting off with the one book I started in 2021 and finally finished this January, which is Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. This is the final installment in the Throne of Glass series, and it has been a long time coming for me to get to this book at last. I first started this series in 2015. It was actually one of the first series I picked up because I saw it recommended on BookTube. And so in like 2015 and 16, I read the first 4 books, then took a big break and came back to them in 2020, reread those first 4 books. They did not hold up very well, but then I went on to read the next 3 in the series, including this one at last. And while I've been impressed by how consistently mediocre and muddled this series turned out to be, I am still glad I read it, and this is going to be me trying to justify that. Kingdom of Ash is a pretty decent conclusion to a series, especially, you know, like an epic fantasy series with as much ambition and scope as this one tried to have. And I'd say it's the only book in this series, apart from the very first one, that doesn't feel incredibly bloated and under-edited. I mean, a lot of the plot of the series still could have been slimmed down and reshuffled and reconfigured over the 7 books in a much better way, but this did do a good job of putting together all of those different plot lines and tying them together at the end with a mostly satisfying bow. But also that had more to do with this just being the last book in the series and that kind of being its only job. Obviously there are a lot of things that this book didn't do very well, because I'm only giving it 2.5 stars, and most of those things are things that I also didn't like in any of the previous books either. Our protagonist is still doing this whole like keep secrets until the last second thing in this attempt to be sort of dramatic and martyred, and it's incredibly irritating and pointless every single time she does this. Any mention of fae mates makes my skin crawl. I've hated it from the beginning. I hate it in every single one of the Sarah J. Maas books I have read. It does not appeal to me at all. Neither does her incessant need to pull together every single major character into a convenient heterosexual couple by the end of the series. And all of the heroes repeatedly survive incredibly deadly situations which should have killed them 50+ times. Couple of more specific things to this book that I did not like. You're telling me that the entire plot of this epic 7-book fantasy series has taken place in less than a year? Are you for real? No. Just no. There's quite a lot of big reveal moments, like kind of Deus Ex Machina, if I'm using that correctly. I think there's a lot of that towards the end of this book, and it's kind of just like the same thing that keeps happening, and like, don't want to say what it was, but it was annoying, and even I know that's not a great battle strategy. And this book really did make every single villainous character less scary somehow. I think the treatment of the villains in this book was meant to make them like more complex and interesting, but really all it did was make them a bit more eh. However, all that being said, this was still a fun time. Like, it's a fun, exciting, fast-paced adventure that is enjoyable. It has plenty of cool moments which, if you suspend your disbelief, are fun and cool and dramatic. The whole series is just fun. Like, is it good? Not particularly. Is it fun? Yes, actually, it's very fun in places. And sometimes it doesn't matter if something's not very good, if it's fun. And that is really how I would sum up this entire series. So this has ended up, even at 2.5 stars, being, I think, my second favourite in the series. If I had to rank them, I would go, I think, Heir of Fire, then Kingdom of Ash, then probably Empire of Storms, then Tower of Dawn, then Throne of Glass, then Queen of Shadows. Oh my god, what's the last one? Crown of Midnight, then Crown of Midnight. Pointless book, really didn't like that one. Speaking of pointless, no, that's too harsh a segue. Next, I tried to read Trouble the Saints by Alea Dawn Johnson, which has unfortunately ended up as my first DNF of the year. This is set in 1940s New York, and it is about Phyllis Green, who works for this very dangerous mob boss because she has this kind of magical, kind of paranormal ability to kill people with her knives. Gifts such as this one she has are called hands, and they appear to mostly POC characters, but not exclusively, after they've had a sort of special prophetic dream. Unfortunately, For a book about a woman who has a paranormal ability to throw knives and works as an assassin for a mob boss in 1940s New York, it was surprisingly dull. I only read a third of this book because a third of the way through it switches to a different character's perspective, and I kid you not, it was the only character I cared less about than Phyllis. And I think if I'd stuck it out, it then changes to a third character's perspective 2/3 of the way through, and like, I'm not sorry I gave up at the point I did. I just didn't really care about any of the characters, or what they thought or what they did or what happened to them. And actually every time Phyllis did something, I would be like, why are you doing that? Like, there was just this big disconnect between me and her as a protagonist of at least the first third of the book that never really went away. I did quite like the writing, to be honest. It's very poetic and flowery in a way that I'm sure some people will enjoy, but that also occasionally does tend to cloud and confuse what's actually happening, because like something can be described very poetically and you're like, yeah, but what is actually happening? It just added a level of confusion to a book whose plot I already was finding quite weak. But I did actually write down one quote in particular, and I never pick out quotes from books, like ever, but I really did like this one quote. It was a character is described as having a voice that had broken last week and still bled from the wound. Isn't that just a gorgeous description? Isn't that just an amazing sentence? It unfortunately wasn't enough to keep me enjoying this book at all. The plot has a, how should we say, interesting structure in that nothing really happens, and then something happens that in any other book you would think would be like a big deal, but it happens so early on that it doesn't really feel like it's earned it, and then the book kind of just gets over it very quickly. It felt very muddled, and I was like, I don't really understand or like where this is going, because I don't really know where it's going or how it intends to get there. There is sort of a crime mystery, like murder mystery kind of thing introduced, and I love reading about murder mysteries. If you introduce a mystery in a book, it's very, very likely that even if I don't like anything else, I will become engaged in the mystery and want to keep reading to find out what happens at the end. But with this, I was already so done that I really didn't care about continuing to find out the answer to this mystery. It was not at all compelling enough for me. So yeah, it says a lot that I had already switched off from this book so entirely that I didn't even care about finding out the answer to this mystery. I wasn't even tempted to skip to the end and just find out what happened. Like, I literally didn't care. And so once I realised that if I was going to force myself to keep reading and get to the end, it probably wouldn't end up being more than like a 2-star, I just decided to give up. And it's all a bit of a shame really, because I was very purposeful in how I picked out this book to read. I really thought I had like hit the nail on the head, and I had this formula that was going to help me find a great book, because I read a short story by Lillian Johnson in this sci-fi and fantasy short story collection called A Phoenix Must Burn, and her story that she wrote for it was like one of my 3 favourites. I really, really enjoyed it, and I really liked the beautiful poetic writing. So I went out, I saw that she'd written this book. Sounds very interesting, like a slightly paranormal knife-throwing assassin in 1940s New York. Like, yeah, that sounds so cool. And I really thought I was really gonna enjoy this, and I didn't. Next, I had a couple of really, really good books, actually, to break things more positive. Firstly, I read When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nevo. This is another short novella about this cleric character called Chi, and their job is to travel around and write down stories from history. The first book in this novella series is called The Empress of Salt and Fortune, where Chi hears about the story of this empress, and in this one they hear about the story of a tiger. I read this to fulfill the Buzzwordathon prompt for January, which was to read a book with who, what, when, where, why, or how in the title. I am actually doing a separate reading vlog for all of my Buzzwordathon reads, so I won't say too much about this here, other than I really liked it, and it was better, even better, than the first book. Then I read another excellent book, which was One by One by Ruth Ware. This is a murder mystery thriller inspired / based on And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, but only in the way that it's a group of people in an isolated setting and then someone keeps murdering them. Like, that's where the resemblance ends, really. This is about a company retreat to a chalet in the French Alps, but then they get cut off from everyone else by an avalanche. and people start dying, and it was great. And one particular thing I really liked about this book was the big cast of characters. I think there's 12 of them altogether, like in the chalet, who are like characters and therefore suspects and therefore potential victims as well. I really liked that it had so many characters to draw from, and they all felt very distinct, which was good. Like, I never really got confused about who was who. It did a really good job with each of their characterizations in quite a short amount of time that they already felt like different real people. And this big cast of characters and how much I liked it actually really reminded me of The Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton, which is a murder mystery I read last year and also really enjoyed, because it had this really big cast of characters and therefore more potential for mystery and intrigue. And I think that's something I'll be looking for in future thrillers as well. This was very fast paced. It's a very compelling book that you just want to keep reading. It's very effortless to read, I would say. Like, there's nothing in there that's particularly trying to bog you down or trip you up. Like, you can read it very, very quickly. So it turns out my suspicions were right, and I do really enjoy Ruth Ware's writing. I read The Turn of the Key by her, and I liked the writing in that, and I liked some of the tropes. It was just the mystery itself that let me down. So this one had the writing I liked, had the tropes it turns out I enjoy, and the mystery was great as well. The mystery in this book is just so, like, delicious and perfectly crafted. I find a lot of the time with thrillers and mysteries, like, once there is the final watershed moment and, you know, it's the last big twist of the book and everything is revealed to the reader, all the tension goes out the window, because, you know, there's nothing left to be revealed. Everything has been revealed. There's nothing left to be mysterious or compelling. But this book did a great job of controlling the tension, like, all the way through, and even after what I would call the final big twist of the book, there were still some things left to be revealed, and so it managed to stay compelling right the way to the end. All the way through, the tension was being, like, built up and released in a very controlled way that was just really, really good. And the core mystery of this was just really, really excellent. There were loads of twists and turns. It was exciting and shocking in all of the best ways, and I would really highly recommend this if you are looking for a thriller for your next read. I gave this 4 stars. Next, I read Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which has been sitting on my shelves for, I think, 5 or 6 years now, so I'm very pleased I finally read it. This book is basically a love letter to London. Like, if you don't care about London and you don't want to read a book about London, don't read this. This is about a man called Richard who is drawn into this adventure in London Below, which is this slightly magical part of London that's sort of hidden and invisible from the normal people in London Above. And London Below is full of, like, you know, the literal definitions of some of the names of places in London. So there really is an angel called Islington, and there's an earl who has a court, and Knightsbridge is an actual bridge, you know, stuff like that. And this book was a weird one because I came close to DNFing it multiple times because I really couldn't tell if it was going to end up as more than a 2-star, which I think is kind of my way of judging to give up on a book. Like, if I'm reading it and I'm like, I genuinely don't think this is going to be more than a 2-star, I'm now learning to give up on it. But I did stick with this, and I was rewarded by giving it a 2.5. The sad thing is, I just don't think I get on with Neil Gaiman that much. I don't think his books are for me. I have previously read The Ocean at the End of the Lane, which I gave 2 stars. I tried to read The Graveyard Book, which I gave up on. I also tried to read Stardust, which I gave up on. And Stardust is one of my absolute favourite films of all time, but the book really didn't do it for me. And this one, I just think it's proved that he's not the author for me, which is a shame because I love reading fantasy and sci-fi, and he is such a big, prolific, famous author in those genres, and he's not the one for me. This wavered a lot between being an okay, yeah, it's fine kind of book, and then having some moments which were genuinely enjoyable, and that's where the 2.5 rating comes from. It did take me a long time to get into. I think it was literally at the 75% mark I realised I was actually kind of into it at last, but it did take that long for me to actually become invested in any of the characters and anything they were doing. This book has a bit of a weird tone to it as well. It's kind of childish, not to say that's negative or positive, like it is a bit, in that the whole idea of London Below is kind of similar to like the naivety of a child looking at the London Tube map for the first time and being like, oh, are there really friars at Blackfriars? Are there really shepherds at Shepherd's Bush? And then the book takes those slightly childish ideas and twists them into something darker and more adult, and you can tell it's an adult book because they say fuck a lot in it. But then it also still has these moments that feel weirdly childish and a bit grating in the tone. So for example, there's a bit where they meet the Earl of Earl's Court, and they get on a tube carriage, and it's, you know, full of like servants and knights, and he's like sitting there on a throne, and there's straw on the floor, and there's chickens running around, and you're like, oh, so it's like a sort of medieval court on a tube carriage. And then the next sentence of the book is like, it was exactly like a medieval court on a tube carriage. And I'm like, yeah, I know, you just described that exactly to me. Moments like that feel like weirdly childish and patronizing, and the book just kept sort of switching between tones, and it was quite odd. Richard as a main character is fine, I guess. A little bit dull. Maybe that's meant to, you know, compare and contrast him to the characters from London Below, who are all a bit sort of crazy and chaotic. But it did mean that he was just quite dull. And our second main character, Dor, is just like a manic pixie dream girl, basically. And I wish I hadn't realised this about her, because once I did, it made reading about her even more annoying. And I actually read this book on my, you know, commute to work and back, going through central London, which was probably like the best way to experience it. Like it was fun to read while going through stations, you know, like Oxford Circus and Charing Cross, and reading a book all about London. Like I'll give it that. But again, if you don't care about London and you don't want to read a book whose main character is basically London, steer clear from this. And I mean, I love London, and I still didn't really enjoy it that much. Next, I read an ebook from my library. I read A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. This is a solid YA fantasy that I ended up enjoying and gave 3.5 stars. This tells the story of Karina, who is a princess who needs the heart of a king in order to do like an ancient ritual and to resurrect her mum. And it's also about Malik, who needs to kill Princess Karina in order to get his sister back, as she has been kidnapped by an evil spirit. The plot of this book was actually really good, and I really liked it. The opening sort of immediately sucks you into this world. Like it's a really good opening of a book. But I will say that the plot takes a while to get going, in that it takes like the first 100 and 150 pages to catch up to the synopsis I just told you. So all the time you're reading it, that beginning bit, you know what's going to happen, because that's what the book is about. But it was still interesting to read. Like, it was really well written. So even though you know what's going to happen for like that first third, it was still really good. I really liked Karina and Malik as characters. They felt very real and vivid, and I even liked the relationship between them and how it developed throughout the book, which I thought was going to be where it would fall down for me, because I don't tend to enjoy romance plot lines within fantasy books. Like, I'm there for the fantasy elements, not the romance, but I actually really enjoyed it. There were several really good twists and turns to the story, which again I really liked. A couple of them I did see coming, but not because it was predictable in a bad way, but because when I was reading it I was like, oh, it would be really good if this happens, I hope it does. And then it did, and I was like, yes. So it was like predictable in a positive way. Plus there were a couple of twists which I genuinely did not see coming, and actually shocked me quite a bit. I think the weakest part of the story was probably the ending. It didn't feel unsatisfying, or it wasn't disappointing in any way, but it did feel like there was a lot of obvious heavy lifting and manoeuvring of characters and situations being done in order to set up for the sequel, and I think that could have been done in a less clunky way, perhaps. The sequel is called A Psalm of Storms and Silence. There we are. And I think I would like to read it. I've heard it's not as good as this first book, but I have ended up really invested in these characters, and I would quite like to find out what happens next in this world. And I really liked reading a fantasy book set in like an African-inspired fantasy landscape. I've never read a book like that before, and I found it really interesting. I really liked the world building, and right from the beginning it felt so real and far-reaching and complex, which I really liked. I think the magic system, which doesn't play a huge role in the story, but I actually think I would have liked it if it had been bigger, because I found it quite under-explained and a little bit confusing. I think it could have been expanded upon, definitely, and there didn't always feel like there was a lot of logic to it necessarily, so I was never really able to rely on the magic system for enjoyment, because I could never really tell what it was doing or what it meant for the characters or the situations, because I didn't really understand how it was used and how it worked. So yeah, I never really felt like the magic system was an element that was a very satisfying part of the story. But it was definitely bolstered by every single other thing in the book that I really enjoyed. The last book I have to talk about is Love in Colour by Bolly Babalola. This is a book of short stories. 10 of them are inspired by myths and legends from around the world, and then 3 of them are her original stories. And I bought this book because I thought it was going to be retellings of the myths and legends, but with more of an emphasis on, non-Western stories, and with an emphasis on giving the women in the stories a bit more agency. And that's not really what it was. I mean, it does focus on more non-Western myths and legends, and it does focus on giving the women agency, but it's not the kind of retellings I was looking for. And actually, to call them retellings at all would be wrong, because they're not. They are kind of whole new stories with some elements that are loosely inspired by some elements from myths and legends from around the world. That is how I would describe it. They are mostly set in our world with no magical or mystical elements, and while I like short stories that are told well, which these definitely were, and I like great beautiful writing, which these definitely had, that is unfortunately just not really the genre for me. But that was the one and only stumbling block to my enjoyment of this book. So I wanted to get out of the way first, because I did enjoy this, and I gave it 3 stars, and I would highly recommend it. It is objectively so good, and it's literally only my problem that I didn't give it 4 or 5 stars. All of the stories in here are so distinct and vivid and interesting, and I really think there was just one, which was Nefertiti. I think that was the one story that I didn't really gel with, because hilariously it had elements that reminded me of Trouble the Saints, in that it's kind of about like the criminal underworld and the mob, which I just didn't really enjoy reading about. And my 2 favourites in here were Orin and Alagameji, which are actually the last 2 stories in here, and are 2 of the 3 that aren't based on myths and legends. I just really loved them, and the writing in this is so good. It's like deliciously gorgeous. I can't think of any other way to describe it. I would read anything else that she writes, like no matter the genre, to be honest, because it was the writing that kept me coming back and that kept me invested. Even once I realised, oh, this isn't going to be the straightforward magical set of mythological retellings that I was hoping for. Like at that point, I realised how much I was enjoying the writing anyway, despite the genre. That's how good the writing was, and that's how good this book is. So those are the 8 books I finished in January and February. I would love to hear what you have recently read and what your favourite book from the last couple of months have been. I think if I had to pick a favourite, it would probably be When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which feels like a cop-out because I didn't really talk about it in this video. So apart from that, my favourite is One by One, I would say. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.